Hi, I'm Sanjay Dixit. I'm faculty at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, and I've been asked to provide a brief overview of the heart model that is potentially going to be used for cardiac arrhythmias, the likely clinical applications of this model. So, just briefly, the overview will give you a sense of how this platform is going to serve the clinical needs in 3 or 4 different scenarios. One of those is assessing and improving performance of cardiac rhythm management devices. And in particular, this will be useful for comparing the efficacy of different algorithms that are used by the different cardiac rhythm management devices for arrhythmia detection and management. What I foresee is the ability of the platform to diagnose arrhythmia mechanisms, both in the setting of cardiac rhythm management devices, and we'll get a little bit more into the details of that. But I also foresee this particular platform as being extremely useful for understanding arrhythmia mechanisms by recreating the different EP scenarios. And in doing so, the model can facilitate more informed planning of procedures for intervention in different cardiac arrhythmia scenarios. And in the long run, I foresee this tool as being highly useful for informed decision making and improving the safety of ablation procedures. And then finally, we'll briefly touch on the ability of this platform to simulate the different arrhythmia scenarios, and through that particular feature, I think it can be an extremely useful tool for education and training of experts that are specializing in the field of cardiac electrophysiology. So let's talk a little bit about each of these. I want to start with cardiac rhythm management devices, and broadly these are categorized into 3 or 4 different groups, and most of these I'm sure you're familiar with. They're permanent pacemakers, which pretty much what the name suggests. These are pacemaker devices for bradycardia or slow heart rhythms. Then there are the implantable cardioverter defibrillators, which are also called ICDs, and these are platforms that have become extremely useful in minimizing the risk of sudden cardiac death in the at-risk population. And these are particularly some of the most common cardiac devices currently in use. And then there is this platform, which is the cardiac resynchronization therapy devices, which is particularly useful in the heart failure population, and that's a very big disease group where these devices are used a lot. And then finally, there are the monitoring platforms or the implantable loop recorders. So in the interest of time, today's discussion, I'm going to focus primarily on implantable cardioverter defibrillators or ICDs. So when you think about implantable cardioverter defibrillators, it's basically carrying the equivalent of what an external defibrillator is within the body. And typically this platform is essentially a small waterproof defibrillator unit that is connected to the heart through leads that can be placed either transvenously into the heart or in the subcutaneous tissue, from where they can also record cardiac activity. And the purpose of the device is that in the at-risk population, it has the ability to detect relatively fast, dangerous heart rhythm and then treat it effectively in a couple of ways, and I'll show you examples. And just to give you a sense how prevalent these devices are, currently on an average there are about 10,000 ICDs being implanted per month in the US, and world over probably it is a slightly higher number. Now, when you think about the ICD platform, it is essentially the can which has the battery which packs the charge to deliver a shock, and it is connected into the heart through a series of wires that are deployed surgically via the venous system. And this is an example of a chest X-ray that shows how the wire sits in the heart. And essentially what the device does is it creates these different vectors between the coils that are on the leads as well as the can, which you have the ability to program as being hot or cold. And based on how you program this, there is a shock vector that you can create for delivering energy in the scenarios where patient is in cardiac arrest or encountering sudden cardiac death. So basically what an ICD can do is it can deliver biphasic DC shock, and you can program the amount of shock that's required. It can also perform anti-tachycardia pacing, where it paces faster than an organized fast heart rhythm to terminate it. And then, of course, every ICD platform has the basic features of a pacemaker, so it can also treat bradycardic rhythms. So here is an example of what is commonly encountered in at-risk patients, which is a scenario where they have gone into this very fast, dangerous, life-threatening heart rhythm called VT or VF. And the only way to terminate this rhythm, if it doesn't terminate by itself, is to cause cardiac standstill. And you do that by delivering a very high energy shock. So the way the defibrillator works, through the wire that is inside the heart, it can sense the cycle length of the electrical activity, and it's programmable, so you can tell the device that at this particular cutoff value, you call it a dangerous fast heart rhythm. And once that happens, the device takes a few seconds to charge up after the criteria for detection are met, and then it delivers the shock and restores sinus rhythm. And so on an average, in an at-risk population, the device intervention has been shown to save lives up to with an improvement in survival of up to 50%. Now here is another scenario where the patient is in a fast heart rhythm, which obviously is hemodynamically unstable, but it is not as fast as the previous rhythm. And in this particular scenario, the device can intervene without necessarily giving a shock by pacing a little faster than the tachycardia, and sometimes that intervention terminates the rhythm, and that's a painless way to effectively deliver therapy. So those are the 2 or 3 things that the defibrillator can do. Now, what are the challenges for the utility of ICD platforms in the clinical scenario? So this is just something that I lifted off the FDA website, and you can see the date on it. It pretty much states that this was done yesterday night, which is 9/6/15. And this is just to provide you an overview of how prevalent it is for these devices to have problems. And so just this one search reveals a 5 or 6 page document in terms of the number of times that these devices have been recalled because of problems. And so one of the big things for us is how to minimize the recalls. And the challenges are several, but this is the one place where this particular heart simulation platform can be a perfect tool, where prior to field trials, we can actually test out the different device components by mimicking the different clinical scenarios several times over to test the platform very rigorously for the different features that are in there. And in doing so, if we can decrease the recalls by even half, that's a significant improvement on what is currently available to us. The second scenario with these ICDs is that while they are programmed to treat fast heart rhythm at a certain cutoff, which is called dangerous or not, sometimes normal heart rhythm can also exceed that parameter, whether it's physiologic, whether it's because of supraventricular tachycardias. And so in up to 20% of the patients who receive ICDs, you can get inappropriate therapies. And while in of itself, the inappropriate therapy is typically not life-threatening, it can have a significant impact on the patient quality of life. And there are some new data that actually suggest that inappropriate therapy has implications for worsening heart failure in certain populations. And so at the present time, the different vendors who manufacture these devices have different diagnostic algorithms that they utilize to treat cardiac arrhythmias and minimize inappropriate therapies. And while there have been improvements, it still remains a challenge for a couple of reasons. One, despite these improvements, inappropriate therapies still continue to be a problem. And then the second thing is we really have not too many clinical trials where there is a comparison made between the different diagnostic platforms. So one of the advantages of having this heart model would be to test the performance of the different algorithms that are currently being used to discriminate appropriate and inappropriate intervention scenarios. And so if we can, number one, test the different algorithms that are currently available back to back to see the performance of one over the other. And then in doing so, we may actually be able to find certain other things that are not currently available to us by way of what were the number of beats that were detected by one algorithm versus the other, and at what stage of intervention. So for example, let's say there are 12 beats that are required for a tachycardia to be detected and then treated. If you were to find through the analysis of this platform that 20 beats perhaps is a better cutoff because it allows much more specificity, then those are the kinds of things which the model will be able to provide to us, which we can then incorporate into the existing algorithms. And then there are scenarios that are impossible to replicate and predict in the clinical world. They are relatively rare. And so those are the off chance happenings, but in that particular patient who encounters them, so for example, there is a lead breakdown and there is noise, and that noise can cause inappropriate therapy. But that is an almost impossible clinical trial to do because you cannot replicate noise and break down a system in a patient who has had this implanted for life-saving intervention. But the model is one place where you can actually mimic that scenario. So those are the kinds of rare situations which the model can also provide information on. So if I were to summarize how the heart model can improve ICD performance, it can help in rigorously testing the different ICD components, so decrease device recalls. It can provide an avenue to test the different algorithms, and hopefully that will help us minimize inappropriate therapy. And then finally, the model will help us generate much more data on different clinical scenarios, which we are currently lacking a lot of data on. And certainly for rarer clinical situations, this would be a perfect place to assess it. So now moving on to the next scenario where the model can be helpful, and that is for diagnosing the correct mechanisms of underlying heart rhythm disorders. And so this is just a very broad overview of what the heart model could be and the scenarios in which the different cardiac arrhythmias happen. So broadly, these are arrhythmias that are generated in the upper chamber or the atrium, and that's where the focus is. It has nothing to do with the rest of the heart. The second scenario is where the SVT actually utilizes re-entry in the AV node. The third situation is where a supraventricular tachycardia spins between the AV node and an accessory pathway. And then the third scenario is where the rhythm is generated in the lower chamber or the ventricle, and that's a ventricular tachycardia. Now, we have the ability to make these diagnoses using surface ECG recordings in a lot of patients, but there are about 25% scenarios where, despite the availability of the 12-lead ECG platform, we still cannot come to a decision about what the underlying mechanism is. And typically, in order to make that decision, what we are required to do is place these multiple catheters through the arterial and venous system into the heart. And the process is obviously an invasive diagnostic study. And any time you do something invasive, there are risks, about 2 to 5% chance of complications. And only once you have all these catheters in place can you make a decision as to what the underlying mechanism is in that scenario. And then you plan in terms of how you're going to target that. Now, the model, with its ability to have different cycle lengths programmed, different atrial and ventricular relationships programmed, perhaps can offer us that information non-invasively, which means we put into the model the different intervals that we have available to us through the ECG, and based on that, the model can interpret for us what the underlying mechanism is. And if we have that information ahead of time, it obviously has implications for how we may be able to then, number one, plan our procedure, because if it's something that's happening in the left side of the heart, then it requires an arterial axis, versus something happening on the right side of the heart is venous axis. Arterial axis is always more challenging. Depending on where the critical part of the circuit is, if it's very close to certain locations, then the only way to get to it is using a very specialized technique and special instruments. And if we know that ahead of time, we can plan for that. And then the last thing is, depending on how the tachycardia mechanism is interpreted and where the underlying critical circuit is, it also allows us to offer the patient a perspective on what the underlying risks are. So it allows for a more informed decision making, both on the part of the patient and the healthcare provider. So in the long run, I think this model could really be an instrument for better delivery of healthcare. And then the last thing, which I think is fairly evident from everything that I've described so far, which is the model has the ability to replicate the different arrhythmia scenarios. And if you can replicate the different arrhythmia scenarios, then this would be a perfect platform for the education and training of people who are specializing in this field. I mean, typically this is a training that requires people to actually scrub in with supervisors on actual patients. And while we have done a good job of being able to train people adequately, there is obviously some level of risk when a trainee scrubs in for a critical procedure. And patients are apprehensive of this, and it's one of the reasons why teaching institutions tend to come under some unfavorable judgment because they feel like trainees participate in these procedures. But if there is a way for the trainees to get simulation ahead of time before they actually scrub in on live patients through this particular platform, then that I think can be huge in improving both the curve by which the training happens, so you can really hasten the training process, and you can improve outcomes. So that's the other piece of where I think this platform can serve a very useful role. And I think that's just the broad overview I have to offer today.
So you mentioned one way in which the heart model could help is in diagnosing arrhythmia mechanisms for cases that present themselves at the clinic. And you said, okay, so we can take the intervals that we have measured, feed those to the heart model, and what you would like to see is, here are the possible causes of this particular arrhythmia that correspond to the ECG that you are observing. Could you give us specific examples of what those intervals are, what those measurements are, and are they sufficient to unambiguously diagnose arrhythmia causes, especially knowing that arrhythmia mechanisms are not as well understood as one would like to?
Right. So I think the place where the model can be helpful is that when you look at surface ECG recording, it's a very coarse recording from far away to the heart, where it makes recordings of the atrial activity and the ventricular activity. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes when you have a reentrant mechanism, sometimes the re-entry part, which goes down from the atrium to the ventricle, then comes up from the ventricle to the atrium, whether it's through the AV node or the bypass tract, the conduction properties of these two are different.
Right.
And so on the surface ECG, the atrial activity for the return wavefront can be superimposed on different parts.
Right.
And that is not always obvious when you look at the surface ECG. So one of the things that the model could do is perhaps you can train it where you can feed in the digital data from the ECG into the model, and then the model has the capability to discriminate those subtle variations based on multiple plots.
So the model would go through the different possibilities and say this possibility seems to fit best.
Well, either it could do that, or it could have the digital information from the different leads of what's ventricular activity, what's atrial activity, and it may be able to discern what a true atrial event is. And the timing of the atrial event to the timing of the ventricular event sometimes is the most critical thing in establishing a mechanism of whether the re-entry is happening in the node or the re-entry is happening through the bypass tract.
Right.
If it is happening in the bypass tract, there is different timings in terms of the conduction properties of the tract, but also where the tract is. If the tract is relatively close to where the ventricular exit is, the timing will be shorter. If the tract is further away. So not only will it discriminate between these two, but it might be able to predict for us how far away the tract is from maybe the septum of the heart. And that information is very critical in planning a procedure and understanding whether if I burn there, is that safe or not.
Okay.
So those are the kinds of things which I think the model can provide.
And the main type of procedure you're thinking about that would make use of this is an ablation procedure. Are there others?
I mean, so for example, any arrhythmia, if you have to definitively target it, you have to get rid of the underlying tissue that's sustaining the arrhythmia. And the only way to do that at this time is ablation.
Okay.
So that's
the
end point of any therapy, which is lasting.
Would this still be useful, such a usage of the model, would still be useful for a patient who is already implanted with an ICD? Because I'm thinking from the EGM, that's closer to the heart than the surface ECG. So are there uses for such a procedure for someone who already has an ICD?
Right, no, absolutely, because ICD platforms are only offered to patients who have structural heart disease and are at a risk for certain cardiac death. The majority of SVTs that I showed you actually happen in patients with normal hearts. So they are two actually very distinct platforms. The majority of patients who have SVTs, supraventricular tachycardias, they actually are very healthy people. So they really don't have any cardiac rhythm management devices. Unless you screw up and you burn something bad, then they'll need a cardiac rhythm management device.
Sure.
But that's where we feel that the model would be, very useful.
Okay.
Because it'll help us guide, give us, information on terms of even if you plan the ablation, how safe is it?
And a question of practical interest, I guess, for us as engineers and for you is, what is the time scale we're talking about? How much time do you have between when the patient presents at the clinic and how, because some of these models are very accurate, but they take a long time to
Sure.
produce an answer, right? And we're talking days. So how much time do we have to produce an answer?
Right, so that's actually a great question. And so the benefit of supraventricular tachycardia scenario is that while these are quality of life affecting arrhythmias, they're not life-threatening.
Okay.
Which means when the patient has them, they're very troubled by it, but typically these are not the kind of heart rhythm disorders that cause mortality. So actually it's an elective procedure where you see the patient in the
I see.
clinic, you inform them of what the procedure is, they make up their mind, and then it's not uncommon that it will take about 3 to 4 weeks from the initial
Okay.
visit to schedule it. So there is downtime
Okay.
for this kind of offline analysis. I guess that's what
Yes, exactly. Okay, great.